Welcome back to another edition of Force Friday, where we talk about Star Wars theories, characters, concepts, comparisons, analyzations, collectibles, and more. And today, with the recent news about LucasArts and video games kind of kicking back into high gear, we're going to go through the history of it, and we're going to do this in 2 videos, so we'll break it down into 2 parts. This is part 1. After the success of Star Wars in 1977, George Lucas found himself a very wealthy man, just rolling in the money, stuffing it in his throat pockets. Always interested in pushing boundaries and experimenting, he founded the Lucasfilm computer division in 1979. This included a video game department. It also included what would eventually spin off and become Pixar. Branded Lucasfilm Games, its mission statement was to create unique, innovative, boundary-pushing games and advance the technology of the medium. Despite being the home of Star Wars, Lucasfilm Games didn't actually have the rights to produce Star Wars games in the 1980s. Those rights had previously been licensed to Atari. I love the game of this stuff sometimes. The cat and mouse. It's like backgammon, the way they chase each other's licenses and franchises around the board. Lucasfilm Games became primarily known for 2D adventure games. 3D graphics and advanced gameplay had yet to really become readily available. And so these point-and-click games with original titles like Monkey Island, and even released several Indiana Jones games. Despite how primitive, Monkey Island, stop it you, and simple they look today, Lucasfilm Games was responsible for many major technological breakthroughs in video games. Patented systems like Amuse allowed music to be timed to the action of a game in a sudden transition between tracks, things we take for granted today but were revolutionary at the time. There is no better testament to this company's ambition than the failed Star Wars flight simulator project from 1990. Teaming up with Hughes Aircraft Company, the plan was for fully realistic theme park rides that would seal the player inside a 360-degree pod where they would duke it out with up to 64 other live players with full control in graphics using military-grade flight simulator technology. Even those waiting in line would be able to participate, manning fixed gun turret stations that could fire on the fighters being controlled by the primary players. As with much of Lucasfilm's work, it was ahead of its time. It's also complete lunacy, much like most of Lucasfilm's work. The project was possible, but simply too expensive and was ultimately canceled because George Lucas forgot to take all those rolls of $100 bills out of his throat. Things began to change with the release of X-Wing in 1993. Spearheaded by Lawrence Holland, who had developed several very successful World War II games for the company, it was one of the first games to use full 3D polygon graphics and immerse the player in a fully controllable first-person X-Wing flight simulator prior to and during the events of A New Hope. It also drove me completely insane because I had no idea where I was going, and I feel like I had to protect a Corellian Corvette. I couldn't even find the thing. I would end up just flying into space for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then trying to find my way back, looking for any hope of a TIE fighter to shoot at along the way. The game also came out during something of a lull for the brand. The Thrawn trilogy had begun some time prior and proved very popular, but the prequel trilogy was still years away, and Star Wars was still more or less out of the public consciousness. Even the 3 3/4 action figure line had yet to return to shelves. The first game to be released under the rebranded LucasArts title, the game proved to be a smash success. Because those people are much better at flying X-Wings in space than I was, I usually, you know what I did? I was shooting for the stars, what I was doing. I was way ahead of my time. I was shooting for the stars, aiming for the moon. But it ended up becoming one of the biggest games of the year and topping many best-of lists. It was so successful that it spawned an entire series. TIE Fighter, released the following year, a standalone sequel that put the player in the mind of an elite Imperial pilot during the events of Empire Strikes Back. It improved on X-Wing in numerous ways, boasting an excellent story, and was another smash success. It's also important to note that I too had TIE Fighter, and you won't believe what I did in it. You guessed it, I would try to defend my Star Destroyer, but end up flying into space for hours upon hours of time and losing track of the Star Destroyer or any hope of seeing an X-Wing to shoot at. But let's fast forward to 1997, where we saw X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, which was somewhat controversial. It largely did away with the story-driven campaign and was built primarily around multiplayer combat, still a new concept in the 1990s. The backlash to the lack of a story was so severe that 2 expansions providing one were later released. The final entry in the series was X-Wing Alliance, which introduced players to an unaffiliated smuggling family caught in the war between the Rebels and Empire, culminating in a massive battle to destroy the second Death Star with the player controlling the Millennium Falcon. It was a home run and a perfect close to the series. I never played it because my dad wouldn't buy it for me because I would just fly into space and he could tell that I wasn't any good at it, which I'm sure in my father's mind was just one thing among many on that that list of things his son was no good at, he still would wish that I was a professional ball player. But we can't always have what we want. Anyway, since then, the games have largely faded from popularity, but a dedicated fan base existed and continued to regularly play the games. This led to something of a spiritual successor with 2020 Star Wars Squadrons. We'll get to that at a later time. The next and perhaps biggest game to come from LucasArts in the 90s was Dark Forces. Doom had exploded on the PC scene in 93, popularizing the first-person shooter genre. The sheer variety of games on the market at the time meant most of these were simply called Doom clones. Dark Forces utilized the basic mechanics of Doom, but added an extra layer with its weapon sandbox, clever level design, and a puzzle aspect that required players to think as they made their way through the game's many corridors. And I'll have you know, I was able to find my way around this game quite easily. Same for Doom. I could see the demons, they were straight ahead, and my double-barrel shotgun had no problem finding its target. The game is also fondly remembered for its strong story. Players were Kyle Katarn, a mercenary rebel agent and former stormtrooper who steals the Death Star plans and faces Imperial General R. Mach and his Dark Trooper project. Yes, the same Dark Troopers that made the leap to the Mandalorian, but more on that later as well. Things we take for granted today in shooters, like jumping and the ability to look up and down, not just side to side, were popularized by Dark Forces. It also used authentic Star Wars sound effects and music to create one of the earliest true cinematic first-person shooters. The impact of Dark Forces can be felt even today. Its success led to Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, which had Kyle learn to use his Force abilities, Jedi Knight 3, Jedi Outcast, and Jedi Knight Jedi Academy, retroactively named the Jedi Academy series. The final game released in 2003, but Kyle Katarn went on to star in numerous expanded universe books and comics, becoming one of the most popular EU characters of all time. But perhaps the most direct indication of the game's impact can be seen in the second season of The Mandalorian, which introduces the Dark Troopers. They are visually adapted for a live-action style, but they are undoubtedly a faithful recreation of the game's villains in form and function. In fact, the entirety of Chapter 12, in which Mando and his crew infiltrate and destroy the Imperial base with the Dark Troopers revealed at the end of the episode, is something of a homage to the numerous infiltration levels of the original game. 1996 saw Shadows of the Empire, a third-person action-adventure game starring Dash Rendar, also known to some as Han Duo. This game was part of a large marketing rollout to test the waters for the Phantom Menace. The question is, how many did you have? I had the novel, the video game, the comic, and the figures, and I didn't have the soundtrack until unfortunately a few months ago when I was gifted one by my buddy Gort. How many did you have? The late 90s also saw a collaboration between LucasArts and Nintendo for the X-Wing Rogue Squadron series, which began in 1998 for the PC and Nintendo 64. Despite being a flight game, it wasn't a first-person simulator like the X-Wing titles. It was from a third-person perspective and utilized an all-new system of power-ups in combat. One of its most exciting features was hidden content from the then upcoming The Phantom Menace. In particular, a playable Naboo starfighter, which was notoriously difficult to unlock. And I loved that game. I still would like to play that game from time to time and often think about it. Despite the massive output of Star Wars content, LucasArts was never considered a Star Wars-only studio and continued to sporadically release original titles, though most of these have since faded into obscurity. Some of this was the games themselves not always being overly exciting, but it was most likely due to the absolute juggernaut that is the Star Wars brand, totally overshadowing anything else they put out. With an excellent reputation and a solid slate of success, LucasArts entered the 2000s with a newly revived movie franchise and a talented studio. But the success of the studio was only just beginning, and the next decade was going to be the golden age of LucasArts. Hope you guys are staying safe. Hope you guys are staying sane. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care. It's a cliffhanger, Joe!